last section, we recap a little bit of Egypt, and it says, it should be clear, easy to understand why ancient Egypt is so regularly held out as the paradigmatic example of state formation. The paradigmatic example. I am going to use a simpler word than paradigmatic. I don't know if I'm using this correctly, but I think I am. The goat. Yeah, Egypt is definitely the goat of state formation, definitely. And the reason it is the greatest of all time is because it combines sovereignty and administration. You get the king and a whole big old bureaucracy going. They build some big pyramids, leave us some nice art, some monuments. They get all the good stuff going. That's why we all love them so much. As Graeber and Wengrow put it, it fits perfectly what everybody thinks should have happened everywhere, because you get, states, kings, bureaucracies, big ships, people working on things all together, peasantries, beer, all the stuff, all the good stuff, beer and bread and beer, fits what should have happened. The Inca too fit this model, but they were much later. I mean, the Inca only get going about 150 years before the Spanish take them out. So it's a much later process, and they've been giving us parallels between Egypt and the Inca, but really the Inca only come about around the year 1400 or so. So Egypt, it's been known about, and you have good evidence for it. It fits everything that we think should have happened. And this is based on a series of assumptions which they have been talking to us about since the beginning of the chapter. The assumption that the more people you have, the more you scale up society, the more you need people to control those people. So once you get above 150 people that you can keep track of, Dunbar's famous number, I think it was 150, somewhere around there, then everything starts going to hell unless somebody starts leading them. So if you have one student, that's one thing. You get to two, you get to 150. That's crazy. Anyway, the control, of course, you not only need, how do you maintain control over all these people? You need to be able to have the threat of forcing them to do something, throw them in jail, do something mean, coercive force, make them do it. And then the idea, again, these are all assumptions, is that in order to make people do things, you start recording, you start bureaucratizing, you start making systems to record their actions and take taxes and all these things. So the assumption is that the more people you have, then the more you need people who control those people. Then you need to have force, and then you need to have some system of recording it. Now, Graeber and Wengrow say that none of this is really true. And we've been seeing how it's not really true all through this chapter. We saw back in the early cities that people were able to organize themselves relatively autonomously and be self-governed. We saw that people have a monopoly of coercive force, but it's not necessarily for control. They just like to have it to be divine kings. And then now we're going to talk about the system of bureaucracy, which we've seen a little bit. But basically, they're saying that none of this is true, and everything that if you try to predict things based on the model of ancient Egypt, it may be the goat, but it doesn't help you predict other things that happen in other parts of the world. Just the Inca, maybe. So, what were the origins of bureaucracy? Where did bureaucracy come from? Well, according to Graeber and Wengrow, it's not in Egypt. It's not among the Inca. It's a place we've never heard of. Tell Sabi Abyad in what is now northern Syria, where they have these, the clay tokens and seals. There you go. There's some good archaeology for you, digging up those things. So you have these clay tokens and seals. They're being used to account for different things and pass between them and record. But it's pretty much at the small village level. This is not a huge settlement. These are not the large bureaucracies that we usually associate with states. So as they say at the beginning of this section, they find the origins of bureaucracy, or a place where it arises, in a much smaller place than they would have suspected, a place nobody's heard about. So this is where we find these things. This is what archaeologists name the Ubaid period, after a settlement in what is now Iraq. And I typed Ubaid period into Google and came up with these things that are in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, or the Met, I think. Anyway, you can go to New York City and see them. What's this? What's this? What's this? Huh? You should say, yes, you should say plate one more time. You're unfortunately slightly incorrect. The Met calls them all bowls. I kid you not. Go to their website and type in the Ubaid period, and they'll show you a picture of 3 things, and they're all called bowls. So I guess whether it's a plate or a bowl is it's a matter of personal preference, whether you call this a plate or a bowl. But the point is, Liz, what do we see when we see these 3 bowls in this period? How much different are they? Yeah, there seemed to be an example of uniformity. Now, why would people want uniformity in their bowls, plates, houses? What are they trying to tell us about themselves? Huh? That they're controlled. If you want everything to be the same and everything to be kind of standardized and everybody to have the same bowl, basically, with a little bit of design here and there, what's your idea of how people should be? The same. Yeah, say it in a nice way, that they're being equal, hey, we all have these bowls here, have some bread. I don't know if they're making beer yet. Drink it out of this bowl, or else if it's a plate, you can eat it out of the plate. I don't know. Plate or bowl, the point is, it's an ideology of equality. According to Graeber and Wengrow, it is possible that this standardization across a pretty large region of the Fertile Crescent at this time, you get this standardization, you get these bureaucratic forms, is actually meant to kind of control status differences. So you shouldn't have too much, and maybe prevent people accumulating more wealth than others. So we have, again, an origins of bureaucracy and standardization and equality in a place that we might not have thought about it, because it's not where we think about bureaucracy emerging. They compare that to the Ayllu system, a system of village life which is in the Andes, in the South American Andes. And basically, the khipu, those knotted strings that we've talked about earlier in the chapter also emerge as this kind of interchangeability, a way of recording debts and obligations. But in the village system, they say that it's pretty flexible. You'd get together every year and you'd untie your strings and retie them based on what was going on. And it was simply a way of keeping track who owed what to whom, but in a pretty flexible system. And for the people who have been, we usually associate the khipu system with the Inca Empire. But in fact, it had been used for hundreds of years before there was an Inca Empire. It was a homegrown system used throughout the Andes in each village across a wide region. And actually, that's one of the reasons why people have been finding these things kind of hidden away, because the Spaniards tried to burn them because they felt like they were associated with resistance and that they were maybe bad. And so a lot of these khipus were destroyed, which has made it very difficult to figure out what was going on. Recently, the archaeologists have been finding some of these kind of tucked away in little places. And they say that, for 90% of its existence, it was used outside of the Inca Empire. But the Incas sort of incorporated the khipu system into their own empire, and then they would basically extract labor or tribute from these places and make it impossible to, and the words of Graeber and Wengrow, impossible to unravel and retie the knot. So it was like, okay, you have your obligations to each other, but you also owe us a certain amount of beer or labor. And so this is the way, in fact, the Inca Empire justifies itself and puts itself on top of this pre-existing system in a similar way that perhaps the Egyptian bureaucracy put itself upon or imposed upon an already existing system. So Graeber and Wengrow note that, interestingly, when it comes to money, when it comes to these ideas of interchangeability, whether it be knots on a khipu string or tokens of exchange, that it seems like a lot of these inequalities that we see, these large-scale inequalities, actually start off in this trying to make people equal, whether it be the Ubaid period of ideologies of uniformity and equality, or with the Ayllu as it's transformed into the Inca. In each case, social relationships become represented by some sort of numeric form or some kind of interchangeability. Now, what they're saying is that this isn't bad in and of itself. It's not that money itself, or that numeracy, or that making things interchangeable is bad. And in fact, you can have these Ayllu systems, or in the Ubaid period, you can have these systems and they can go along. But if you have a monarch, a king, an empire trying to rule over things and appropriate them, then that's when things get tough. Or if you have a local administrator who simply says, hey man, that's the rules. The rules are the rules, and I can't change them. I don't know if you've ever met anyone like that. You have? Yeah, we all know these people. Rules are rules. Nothing I can do. That's what supposedly keeps things fair, but it can feel pretty unfair if people are indiscriminately applying the rules all the time. So again, the principle or the idea of bureaucracy and accounting and making things interchangeable isn't necessarily bad by itself, but it can be linked to badness. So they then examine this in terms of what they call the primordial freedoms. Now, most of this chapter we've been talking about the three principles of domination, of violence, of knowledge, and of heroic politics and trying to monopolize any of those things. And here they contrast them with three primordial freedoms: the freedom to move, the freedom to be able to leave and enter class whenever you want, the freedom to move, we need that, the freedom to disobey, not going to hand in that assignment, and the freedom to create or transform relationships. So to be able to move away from something, get out of town, to do your own thing, not obey orders, and the freedom to create or transform relationships, to be able to remake your social sphere. They say that the word freedom comes to us from the word friend, someone who can enter into obligations or promises or is free to make those promises. And they say that what happens is that there's a bureaucratization of promises. So what happens in these systems is you get these equivalencies. Again, the equivalencies are not necessarily in and of themselves bad as a local accounting system. But what you get are these transferable obligations. So you're turning an obligation into something that can be passed from one place to another. And then when these people come along and try to rule over you, well, Matt, how do these rulers portray themselves? How do they see themselves? What do they think, or what do they want us to believe they're doing when they come in and administer their bureaucratic systems?
Yeah, they're kind of like monarchs, like they fed the people. Yeah, they like protected the weak.
Yeah, they're the people who kept us all going. So, you know, you get these obligation systems, and then these other people come in and they say, yes, we're collecting tribute, but the reason we're collecting tribute is because we're defending the poor and we're feeding people, and isn't it great under us? They are claiming that often this results in a loss of freedom, the loss of the freedom to move away, the loss of the freedom to remake relationships. You end up in debt or in obligated to state government, to the government, and they call this the confluence of maths and violence. Right? You can exercise control by means of giving out numbers to people. The confluence of maths and violence. On a small scale level, that's what happens when you get graded. Numbers make you feel bad. Influence your life chances. They then take us back to this idea of the origins of the state, which is, again, what all these social scientists have been looking for. Where did this state government come? And they tell us that when the Spaniards were going in and trying to conquer the Aztecs or the Inca, they didn't talk about the state. They weren't looking for the state. They would portray people as having a kingdom or having an empire or having a republic. And Graeber and Wengrow says, those are fine terms. Those are just as good as other terms. Why? We don't actually need to try and figure out what the state is, because in fact, that's just a way of making things sound more scientific than they actually are. They tell us that these early governments, which we've called the state or early states, they didn't even have full-time standing armies. They didn't have full-time specialists. In fact, they may have even been seasonal phenomena, things that came and go with the seasons, like we saw with other among different societies, hunting and gathering, and even agricultural societies. They would have a big state time and then go home. Actually, sometimes when I think about the United States Senate and all the breaks they take, it seems very seasonal as well, but their seasons affect our lives more than we'd think. But even, you know, the Supreme Court, for example, they have the season of argument and the season of rulings, and then they go away, leaving us all with the rulings. But in the old days, they might have just disappeared. They also say that oftentimes there's a gap between the claims to power, how much power a ruler would say he had. We saw this in the case of the Natchez, and actually having power. So that you might say that you're in control of a large territory or all these people, but you may not actually have that power. Now, the sovereign or the king will often make attempts to expand that power. So one of the things that they can do is they mention that they try to make everybody say their name whenever they're taking an oath or saying hello to people. You can also try to put your face on the money. And once you have your faces on money, oh, there it is. The king would become the necessary means by which his subjects establish relations with each other in much the same way as later heads of state would insist on putting their faces on money. Now, as we all know, if we look in our wallets and can find a $20 bill, this is not the face that is on the money. Still Andrew Jackson. Obama's promised us, well, he said he wanted this in 2020, but then things went a little haywire between 2016 and 2020. So Harriet Tubman is not yet on the $20 bill. Apparently, they say we'll get it in 2030 for sure. 2030. Yeah, that's not too far away. We're almost there. So it takes a while. It takes a while to displace these old people who get their faces on money, and they stay there for a long time. Difficult to get rid of them. Similarly with the pyramids. Pyramids may have been a product of seasonal labor, right? They may not have been doing this all the time, but once you have a pyramid there, you can always go by and look at it, and there it is for thousands of years now, some of them. So it makes their power seem very much eternal into the present. So they wrap up this whole section. If anything is clear by now, this is the bottom of page 431. If anything is clear by now, it's this. Yeah, that's always a good statement. If anything is clear by now, it's this. What is it? Where we once assumed civilization and state to be conjoined entities that came down to us as a historical package, take it or leave it forever, what history now demonstrates is that these terms actually refer to complex amalgams, complex things being put together of elements which have entirely different origins and which are currently in the process of drifting apart. So we haven't talked about this much, but one of the reasons we might want to think about how the elements of domination come together and how the elements of freedom might be exercised is because, in fact, in today's world, the state or government power seems to be, maybe, disassembling a little bit. A lot of people don't perhaps live under the same kinds of state control which we saw maybe 50 or 70 years ago. Now, we don't want to be too hasty and say the state is falling apart, because it seems to have remarkable resilience. Like money, it's difficult to displace the people whose heads are on it. But it does seem that, we need to think, or as they say, to rethink the basic premises of social evolution is to rethink the very idea of politics itself. So if we can figure this out, we may be able to figure out future possibilities. Now, at this point, they go into something they call a coda, which is usually something that you don't read because it's the end of the chapter and it's a coda. It's usually a sign that you don't have to read anymore. It's like an appendix. But I think this is perhaps one of the most interesting sections, and I'm glad a couple of you tackled it, although one of the people who tackled it is not here. So we're just going to have to rely on the other person who read the coda. Civilization. Now, actually, let's first think back to our archaeology training and our textbooks and things we've read and all the things we've read about civilization back in the day. How do you remember, how do you define what a civilization is? How do you know when you're dealing with a civilization, archaeologically speaking? Unified culture. Well, I mean, that could be on your way to a civilization. Usually a unified culture, though, I guess that would be just, you know.
Say urbanization, but and yet there's a lot of places that
You definitely need a city. Yeah, I mean, you know, if you're trying to think about the advent of civilization, most textbooks would say you need at least one city in there, for sure. Yeah, Gabe.
the governing body has a monopoly over violence.
Yeah, I mean, that's basically what, yeah, you have a government, you have a city, that city has a monopoly over violence. That's kind of the classic example of what we call a state, right? What makes a state a civilization, though? At least according to my intro textbook, which I always get mad about when I read it, but that's what they say. Most people say, or at least my textbook says, that a civilization is when you add on the writing part. And so you have a city, you have the government controlling violence, and then you get some writing in there, and then it's a civilization. Now, I'm not exactly sure, like I say, this makes me mad, just because I think it just means, aha, now they're writing things down, and often if we can decipher, then we can tell what was going on, and we're like, oh, great, must have been a civilization. Yeah.
One though that civilization pretty strong.
Huh?
How about like pretty strong for sides and
Yeah, I mean, that's, well, let's just say that this is the way that it's kind of been defined, and we're going to redefine it anyway, so let's go into that. The problem with these examples of early civilizations are, and again, this actually is the other reason that makes me mad, but Graeber and Wengrow put it in words in ways that I can now express it when I'm teaching Intro to Anthropology. That you name these places as civilizations, but these places are like hugely class stratified, very unequal. You have kings and rulers that are very authoritarian, lots of violence, and usually very patriarchal. And they've subordinated the women in these instances. These are not great places to live. And in fact, if you lived in these places, you'd probably want to get out of them as fast as you could, unless you were the king or associated with the king. And you don't want to be too associated with the king, because then you'll probably be buried with the king, and that sucks too. So these are not the greatest places. And so when we think about civilization, it's supposed to mean something good, right? It's supposed to mean good things. And in fact, the word civilization comes to us from those qualities of living together voluntarily. And as they say, the root word for it has more to do with voluntary association, political wisdom, and mutual aid. Or we might say large spheres of interaction and hospitality. So places where you could go between different groups, and you might have welcome and hospitality because you belong to a certain clan, or you could be fit into these extended moral communities, which that's what I'd like to believe is a civilization. I don't want to be in a place that's all warring with each other and authoritarian and violent patriarchies. That's bad. But civilization should be this. Gabe who should be at the center of who is at the core of these large spheres of interaction, hospitality, political wisdom, and mutual aid? Who do we find there? Women, yeah. So instead of women being left out of civilization, they're at the core of civilization in this model. And we've seen how they kind of recap for us that women are very involved in plant-based knowledge and doing those textiles and various weaving things, and you need maths to be able to do that. And so this is a long quote, but I thought it was worth thinking about. What until now has passed for, quote, civilization, quote, civilization, might in fact be nothing more than a gendered appropriation by men, etching their claims in stone of some earlier system of knowledge that had women at its center. Center spelled in the British way, not the American way. Don't spell it like that, or else Microsoft Word will knock you over with a red line. Red line right under that one. They'll send you back to Harry Potter school. So this is it's an interesting thing to think about, right? That again, those places where we usually say, aha, there's a civilization, maybe they were a gendered appropriation of an earlier system of knowledge that had women at its center. Now the question becomes can we find any evidence of this? Because that's a pretty bold claim. And it turns out maybe we can. In Minoan Crete. Gabe, you sure you've never seen this?
No. I don't think he was any Minoan art.
Well, this is a good one. Yeah, that's a pretty good one. So in Minoan Crete, we see a lot of apparently female authority in the artistic realm. And yeah. And you know, the archaeologists, the guy archaeologist who discovered Minoan Crete, this is an island off the coast of Greece, right? They're always looking around for kings. They're trying to find some kings. If they find a palace or something, they're trying to tell us there was a king there, but there does not seem to be evidence for having guy kings, even though people have been looking for them for a long time. Seems to be a lot of female authority going on. There are these palaces that don't actually seem to be in contrast to what was going on in Greek and other areas. They don't have fortifications, don't need them. You have all this wonderful, beautiful art where the sea and people are doing all kinds of crazy things. Again, they contrast this with what was going on in the mainland of Greece, which some Greeks want to appropriate what was going on in Crete as the origin of Greek civilization, but looks kind of different here. So this is a pretty interesting place. I think this is called the Palace of Knossos, which you can go see today. I love how you look up these things on Google and you get these wonderful archaeological images, and you can still go there today. But the problem is if you go there today, you're going to have to fight it out with all these people in order to see the actual palace. You have to knock them out of the way and make sure they get out of their selfies and all that stuff, because there they are. All these places are often heavily touristed, except for in Mississippi. You can go down to Poverty Point and see the grand village of the Natchez, and you don't have to elbow out anybody. You can just walk around there almost in solitude. But if you go over to Minoan Crete, you got to get rid of all these hat-wearing people. Yes, Cyrus.
Why are you trying to sell us Mississippi?
Huh? Why am I trying to sell you Mississippi? I'm trying to sell me Mississippi. I mean, obviously, I have no desire to go to Mississippi, but I have to say, it looks like we should be going there because of and that place in Louisiana, because, oh, it was in Louisiana. That's where Poverty Point is. I'm getting my states mixed up. They're pretty close together there. Go down there. You can Same place. Walk around there with the Natchez and Poverty Point, Louisiana. I think it's pretty close.
That's like the state
One
I've
trip.
always left off when I'm counting all the states.
You've left off? What do you mean you left it off? It's not even at the end of the alphabet. Those are the L and the M states.
Anyway, I was going to ask, like, sorry, I was going to ask, like, is it like not normal to have like, I mean, they're like an island nation, right? So, like, why wouldn't they have fortification for their towns?
Yeah, I mean, maybe that has something to do with it. You have an island nation, you know, like Taiwan, they don't have to fortify anything. Yes, they do. The problem is island nations do have to be fortified. Other people are always coming around wanting to invade you. Yeah, no, I mean, maybe that might have something to do with it. Maybe they didn't have to worry so much about people coming in, but I don't know. Weren't people always coming in over the sea trying to maraud you in the Mediterranean? Anyway, the point is, though, Cyrus, most of the rulers look like people like this. Female political rule. Pretty much all, this is a quote from page 438, pretty much all the available evidence from Minoan Crete suggests a system of female political rule, effectively a theocracy of some sort governed by a college of priestesses. A college of priestesses. Ah, there you go. Never seen that, Gabe? No? Oh my gosh. Maybe the art history teachers are afraid to show these things because, you know, they'll get thrown out because of showing the dress of, yeah, I don't know.
One art history teacher now.
one art history teacher now and he's gone. Well, yeah, I don't know. Did you have classes with Dr. Ayer? Was she around before?
Yeah, but we talked about like my student reads.
Too soon. Didn't get there, huh? Yeah. So at the end of the chapter, at the end of the coda, they tell us to once again, as we're thinking about where governments are going in the future and how we're going to make these archaeological, we are making more and more archaeological discoveries of these large scale, we might say settlement civilizations of the past in places where we didn't think they would be. And they beg us, they ask us to not just project our idea of what a state should be, a government with a monopoly of coercive violence over a territory ruled by men bureaucracy. Don't just project that backwards into the past and look for it in the places that we can, that wherever we find scaled society. Instead, if it is possible, we should look at the paintings that they have made. Here's a sentence for you, Gabe. More than almost any other form of human activity, painting on walls is something people in virtually any cultural setting seem inclined to do. Guess we're always inclined to paint on the walls. And they say that they were probably doing this on animal skills as well. So here's this almost cultural universal. The problem is these painting on walls, they crumble, they disappear, people paint over them. Somebody just painted over in red the wall today. It says, "Welcome to Hartwick," and then they just painted it all over in red. They didn't even paint anything else on there. They got to get to painting. Anyway, the point is that so oftentimes we discover these things and we don't have evidence of what they're actually doing. We have bare walls and they probably painted them, but now we can't see it anymore, or it crumbles. But if you can, take a look at their paintings and don't just project your idea of what should have been going on onto the past. Make sure, this is actually a reconstruction of, you know, fragments, but make sure if you can, that if you're going to be taking You don't actually even have to take an art history class. Just make sure somebody shows you a picture like this and you wonder, wow, that's different.